joined now at the interview desk by Pulitzer Prize-winning author, historian, national treasure, local treasure, and pretty wonderful person, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Her latest spectacular book, Margie and I just finished it last night, I think, An Unfinished Love Story, Personal History of the 60s. She'll be at we'll tell you all about it in a minute. She'll be at the First Parish Church, which is a great place, in Cambridge tonight for a Harvard bookstore event. First, she joins us on BPR. And Doris, I want to say, it's a pretty big crowd for us, so you better not screw it up. That's all I can say.
I promise to try. Who
Doris,
knows?
it's great to see you.
I'm so glad to be with you guys. This has been a staple. Whenever I do a book, it really is a good talisman to be
We're
here.
thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us. And I said to Doris before we went on the air, this is not just a wonderful story about the 60s. It's a wonderful story about your romance and your life up in Concord with your husband and your kids and the whole thing. But tell us how this began, how you went back into the documents that Dick Goodwin had saved from the 60s and created this book.
Well, through our entire married life for 42 years, he had schlepped these boxes around with us. They were in basements, they were in attics, they were in storage, and he wouldn't open them because the 60s had ended so sadly with the death of Robert Kennedy, who he was with when he died, and his great friend Martin Luther King, and the campus violence and the riots in the streets. So they just stayed there, and I had looked in them. I knew they were going to be great to open. Finally, he turns 80. He comes down the stairs singing. He says, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." And I said, "What's going on?" He says, "I'm going to open the boxes. It's now or never." And this is the way he talked. If I have any wisdom to dispense, I better start dispensing now before it's too late. So we made a deal that every weekend we would look in the boxes, and we'd do them from the beginning to the end so that we would pretend we didn't know the sorrow that would come later and enjoy the extraordinary part of the 1960s.
Songs from Oklahoma, correct? I have it right?
You got it exactly right.
You know, I can't believe I'm going to ask you a question about self-doubt, but I'm going to try to get it out looking at you. This was intended to be his thing with you helping. Obviously, he died in the middle of this, and it became your thing. Were you nervous about doing this project that you were intended to be essentially the aide, the partner to your husband, and all of a sudden it was yours, and how much it meant to him?
Absolutely. I mean, I wasn't sure for really about a year and a half. I was moving from Concord to Boston, so there were a lot of things happening in my life, and I was still processing the fact that he had died. I was afraid that if I spent a couple more years on this, I'd be living without him and would only make me sad. As it turned out, once I decided to finally do it, it meant that he was coming alive again. I mean, I spent my whole life bringing dead presidents to life. So here I had a guy who was my husband, and I could bring him back to life for people, as well as tell a story of history, and well as a biography and a memoir and all these things. And then I'd be in it, too. So that was a new form for me, in a sense. So it was scary.
But by the way, I have to say, I know I knew a lot about your husband. I know so much more after having finished the book. And he was such an intimate part of history that is so important to all of us today.
Well, some of it that was fascinating to you is because you were reading about his life before you knew him and reading letters from his early days. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I always wanted to know what he was like as a young man. I wished I'd always met him in college and that we had been the same age. He was 12 years older than me. So I kept asking him, "What were you like when you were 20? Tell me, would I have fallen in love with you?" And he said, "How do I know what I was like? I was too busy being him to tell you what he was like." But I found 50 letters that his best friend and he had exchanged together, and the best friend had given Dick's parts back to him before he died. And I loved the guy that I read about. I mean, he was so vibrant and arrogant in some ways and brassy and full of self-deprecating humor. And I realized that, yes, this is the guy I would have fallen from. So I also found in him a different person than I knew. There was a sadness in him from the time I met him because his first wife had died, John Kennedy died, Bobby Kennedy had died. All that sadness had happened. He was full of vitality, but there was that layer. But the young guy I met was just, I greet every day with Eureka, every cheerful face I find. So it was interesting, and we talked about that, and it really helped to talk about that before he died.
Well, speaking of Dick Goodwin in his 20s, he ended up serving a guy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in the White House. How'd that happen?
Well, what happened is they needed a second speechwriter because Ted Sorensen was there alone, and he was going to become a candidate for the presidency. So Dick was asked to write a speech and then write another one. He just thought that he was being asked to draft a help speech. Turned out he was in a contest that he didn't even realize 30 other people had been asked the same thing, and they chose him to do it. So he's still in his 20s. He's on the plane with John Kennedy. It's a small prop plane, so it's so intimate. You see the chairs that he was sitting in that turned into beds for him and Ted. John Kennedy had his own bed in the back of it. But there was a small team compared to today, so there was a real sense of, I can see why they felt they were connected to one another.
Remember they named the plane the Caroline after his daughter, Caroline.
Correct.
But let's play a little sound of JFK. This is in 1960. He's calling on students at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to dedicate part of their lives to public service. Here's JFK.
How many of you are willing to work in the foreign service and spend your lives traveling around the world? On your willingness to do that, not merely to serve 1 year or 2 years in the service, but on your willingness to contribute part of your life to this country, I think will depend the answer whether a free society can compete. I think it can, and I think Americans are willing to contribute, but the effort must be far greater than we've ever made in the past.
So he's talking about the Peace Corps, and Dick was very involved in this. Tell people.
I love this story because what happens is he wasn't planning to speak that night at the University of Michigan. He was simply going there to sleep the next morning to go on a whistle-stop tour of the state. He gets there at 2 in the morning. There are 10,000 kids who've been waiting for him all night. So he says, oh, I better say something. Dick and Ted had gone off to the cafeteria to get something to eat. And so he's on his own. And look what he did. He came up with this extemporaneous. It was a 3-minute speech. He said it was the longest, shortest speech he'd ever given. And in it is the birth of the Peace Corps. He didn't even mention the name. What happened, and this is how change often happens, it should make young people feel a sense of possibility. There were 2 graduate students listening. The kids were so excited by those questions. They put out a pledge to 1,000 people signed a pledge, young students, yes, we'll give 2 or 3 years of our life. And then it was learned by Ted and Dick that they had done that. They brought the pledge up to JFK, and then they announced the Peace Corps. So the birth of the Peace Corps took place because the kids took the action. So it's really those kids that are responsible. And
Based
that's what
upon
happened.
that 2 a.m. speech.
Exactly.
That's just incredible. It really is incredible. We're talking, obviously, to Doris Kearns Goodwin, this incredible book, An Unfinished Love Story, a personal history of the 60s. Now, you both worked for... Oh, I'm sorry, you go ahead.
I was also going to say, I learned a lot about the closeness between Jacqueline Kennedy and your husband, Dick, and you have this great description of this Nobel laureate dinner. Tell people that.
You know, what happened is they had worked together on a number of projects. They became close. And he sent her a memo saying, how about a dinner for the Nobel Prize winners? And that turned into what has been called the dinner in Camelot. All of them came, and then Pulitzer Prize winners were there. And what was so glittering about it was many of them in different fields were meeting each other for the first time, people that they admired, too. And he got to escort, Dick, my husband, got to escort Jackie to that dinner. And there's a picture that was always on our wall he was so proud of. He's walking, the violinists are there. He looks like he's just in heaven. But they became good friends, even after that. Dick was a big cigar smoker, and he taught her how to smoke 1 puff at a time each time they met each other. And he figured finally she had smoked at least a complete cigar before it was all over. An odd thing to think about her doing.
You know, by the way, I just want to interrupt to say, I'm listening to the 2 of you talk. You know how sometimes you have you step out of the environment you're in? I look at you and I said, oh my God, that's Doris Kearns Goodwin.
That's right. That's
just
right.
really strange. We're talking to Doris Kearns Goodwin.
And you also talk about how Jackie wrote him letters, and they had this correspondence going on. You have a great description, too, of Kennedy's assassination. That night when the body came back from Dallas to the White House. Tell us about how Jackie was involved in making the East Room I think as you put it, a private, dignified space for his body to arrive, and what they did to the White House.
Yeah, as soon as he heard the news, my husband did part of a small team to plan for the funeral, and they got word that what Jackie wanted was for the East Room to look as it had looked when Lincoln was there. So they had to break into the Library of Congress, which was closed. They had to use flashlights to get the material because the lights were out. And they found a drawing of what it was like for Lincoln. And then they all worked together to hang the crepe, to make it look like it did, so she would feel that at least he had come home, just as you say, in a dignified way. And then my husband was also responsible for getting the eternal flame that she wanted. She knew then she wanted him like a little boy who would want light, to always be there, to have light. So he had to call the Pentagon. They couldn't get it. They finally got it, and it was at the gravesite by the time he got there.
Yeah, what was the concern? That somehow it wasn't going to light if she lit it, or because Jacqueline lit it the funeral day?
It was so last minute. They had propane tanks there. They finally had something that and they tested it, but they thought, what if it doesn't work when she does this? And it worked. So it gave a beautiful moment, actually, to what was such a sad moment.
I love the description of those small pots of light in the driveway, so that when the body came in the driveway, the lights would be there, and the black crepe all on the windows and all that.
Yeah, this was all for her to feel that he was coming home to a lit White House, because it would have been dark at night. So they knew only when they had parties did they have these outdoor lights. So they made sure to get those lights. Everything was last minute. So they were there without sleeping for a couple days.
Okay, so you and your husband worked for LBJ at different times. But even those of us who are not great historians know that if you're a JFK guy, like your husband was, you don't work for LBJ. So how'd that happen?
Yeah, there really were fault lines, especially between Bobby and LBJ. I think Bobby could never bear to look at LBJ as president because he thought his brother, who he loved more than himself, should have been there. So that was part of it. And so what happened is, though, after Dick had left the JFK administration, obviously he wasn't sure what he was going to do, we found a tape that showed us the origin of how he got there to be a Kennedy person getting to the White House. Johnson's talking to his aide, Bill Moyers, and you hear him on the tape saying, I need somebody who can write speeches for me. I want somebody who can put sex into the speeches. I want somebody who can put rhythm into the speeches. I want somebody who can write great Churchillian phrases. I mean, it's just crazy. Who do you know? And Moyers, who knew Dick from the Peace Corps, said, the only one is Goodwin, but he's not one of us. But Johnson decided, well, let's let him try on a poverty message that really cared, and he ended up becoming his main speechwriter. And it was probably the most important work that he did in public life, working on the Great Society, working on the We Shall Overcome speech.
You know, Doris, since you've covered so much of American history, let me posit something and tell me if this is true. My takeaway from a lot of American history is some of the great things that have ever been conceived have been conceived when several naked men get together. Is that, would you agree, is that generally the case?
He's actually right, I must say. No,
tell this
I'll tell the
incredible
story. It won't sound as crazy as it is. Well, maybe it will. What happened is about a month after Dick got there, Moyers said, okay, he wants to talk to us now about a Johnson vision. He's gotten the tax cut bill through, which was Kennedy's. He's getting the civil rights bill that Kennedy had inspired and put in. Now he wants his own program. So he wants us to talk about it. So Dick says, where? In the Oval Office? He said, no, in the White House pool. So they get to the White House pool, and Johnson's in there naked, swimming up and down the pool. And he looks like a whale, Dick said. And then they're wearing their suits and their ties. And he says, come on in, guys, come on. So they just have to strip on the spot. The next thing you know, 3 naked guys are swimming around the pool. And then Johnson pulls over to the side. He says, okay, guys, now let me tell you what I want to do. And this is the amazing part. He had a vision of everything he wanted. He wanted Medicare. He wanted aid to education. He wanted to finish civil rights. He wanted voting rights. He wanted immigration reform. He wanted NPR. He wanted PBS. And they're just exhausted listening to him. And then they said, well, we'll make a speech, and that's where we'll announce what this thing will be. They didn't even have the word Great Society. So they started debating, what are we going to call this Johnson program? Somebody thought it should be called a Better Deal instead of a New Deal. Someone thought it should be called Glorious Society. But Dick put into 1 or 2 speeches a Great Society, and it caught on. So that's how the Great Society was born.
Can you tell for younger listeners, I mean, there were hundreds of bills that effectuated this thing. Just that you touched on some of them. Spend a second or two on some of the powerful things that we benefit from 60 years later.
Yeah, I
today.
mean, just look around you. I mean, the thing that was so amazing about this program was that he announces it then in April and May of 1964. He wins the election big, and then he puts his mastery of the Congress behind him, and hundreds of bills are formed. Pollution control, aid to the cities, everything you think about in terms of health care. You think about education, secondary education, student loans, student scholarships. He just had a feeling that it was an affluent society that deserved to give more of its affluence to ordinary people all the way up and down the scale. And that was what's amazing about it. When you think about, he went to the same place, the University of Michigan, that JFK had been. Right. That was kind of chutzpah to do that. And he asked a similar series of questions to those kids, saying, are you willing to really fight for everybody in the society having a free chance to get where their talents and their discipline can take them? So it really was, and the country was behind it at that time. They wanted the country to be better for everybody, not just for the people at the top.
Well, speaking of the country better for everybody, including people whose skin color was not the same, the words that your husband wrote that had the most impact for me every time I hear them is the speech that LBJ gave after the violence at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And I'm assuming most people know the incredible last several words. Here's just a little piece of this 1965, let's call it his We Shall Overcome speech.
These are the enemies: poverty, ignorance, disease. They are enemies, not our fellow man, not our neighbor. And these enemies too, poverty, disease, and ignorance, we shall overcome.
It's unbelievable. Was there any doubt that he'd say those words?
Well, it was such an interesting moment because Johnson decided on a Sunday night that he was going to give this speech to a joint session of Congress calling for the voting rights bill after the country had been so shocked by what they saw at that bridge. The Alabama state troopers set upon the peaceful marchers led by John Lewis, sending many to the hospital, and we all saw it on television. I was watching it as a graduate student. I couldn't believe it was my country. And so Dick had only that day to write the speech. And he starts it off with, he always wanted a great line to start it off. He starts it off, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I mean, how can you do that in that time? God. And then he said, every now and then history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was in Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. Not a northern problem, not a southern problem. It's not a moral problem. It's simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans the right to vote. But then in the middle of the day, he was so tired, he went out to have one of his trademark cigars, and he heard people in the distance singing, We Shall Overcome. He came back in, and then he brought the anthem of the civil rights movement into that speech. And that's when change happens, when the country is fired its conscience by some movement, whether it's a gay rights movement, a women's movement, a civil rights movement, progressive movement, and then the people in power respond. And then 6 months later, the Voting Rights Act passed. So that was a great moment.
You know, a couple of times it's mentioned that two Brookline boys, this is going back to JFK and your husband, Dick Goodwin. But where did all this come from? I mean, he obviously, I know he's number one in his law school class at Harvard, which is no mean feat. But
with Ruth Bader Ginsberg in the class.
That's right. That's right. There was a great picture.
There's that picture.
Yeah.
That picture. If
picture.
I just describe it for a minute, I came upon this picture just after he'd been writing a letter to his great friend, George Cuomo, saying he's now the editor of the Law Review. I can get a job anywhere in the country. It's a burden of choice. What should I do? Should I go there or here? And I got so mad at him because I found this picture of the Law Review, and there's two women out of the 60 guys. One is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She can't even get an interview for a job. Right. So I said, it's your fault. No, it's not my fault. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
What was his upbringing like? I mean, obviously he was a really smart guy. Some people would say he's a genius. How did this happen for him?
Well, he loved history, number one, and he loved Lincoln. So when I worked on Lincoln, it was such a partnership to be able to work with him on that. But also, after he became first in his class at Harvard Law Review, he had not had, his family was a middle-class family, but his father had lost his job during the Depression and never quite recovered. So he came back to school to do footnotes for the other professors. He was in the library. He said, I've been in libraries my whole life. I've got to get away. He volunteered for the Army. And that was a really important thing for him. He went to France, unlike my son Joey, who was in combat after 9/11. He was like Stripes in a way. But still, he saw Europe, and he thought it was the most exciting thing for him in the world to go from one country to another. But then when he came home, he realized, he said, you know, there's something about, he was back at Fort Dix, there's something about America that even if it's not true, a person can believe they can rise through the system, and we've got to make them do that. And that was his mission from then on. He loved history. He felt so grateful to America having come back from the Army that I think the rest of his life he used those words to bring us closer to our ideals. That's really what it was about. Always, every speech of his had to do with something that we believed in from the days of the Declaration, the Constitution, the framers, the beliefs of America that still were not being realized.
Well, I read that part of the reason this meant so much to you, this project of going through his papers and writing this book, was to kind of reconvince him that all that he had done with JFK and Johnson and RFK mattered.
Oh, you're so right. I mean, I think the emotional thing that was so important for me is that he had come away from the 60s, as I say, with this sense of sadness, and he felt like the war, he had turned against the war after he left the administration and had been very activist against it. He was with Gene McCarthy in New Hampshire, then he was with Bobby in his campaign, and he felt like the Great Society had been swallowed up. I mean, he knew rationally that wasn't true, but he felt it emotionally. But then once we bed through those years of 64 and 65 together, remembering that we were forgetting what happened later, I remember once when we went up to bed and he couldn't go to sleep, he said, oh my God, I'm beginning to feel affection for that old guy LBJ again. and he did. He began to realize what extraordinary things LBJ did, and it made him feel like he had done something important, that the country had been made better. And it coincided with the 50th anniversary of all these great laws, Medicare and Medicaid and aid to education and voting rights and civil rights. And as a result, the country was beginning to absorb what Lyndon Johnson had done. So that in that last year when he died, he really felt like, maybe I have been able to contribute something to the country. And I think we all want to believe that we've left something behind. And he felt like he had left something behind, and boy, did he.
You also wrote about this, Robert Kennedy referred to it before, RFK, his feeling that LBJ was stealing the bills that should have belonged to John Kennedy, and there was a constant friction between the two men.
Yeah, interestingly, one time Bobby was so sad at the fact that he had only lived his brother 3 years, and he didn't have a fair shot at getting remembrance in the same way. So Dick said to him, well, Julius Caesar only lived 3 years, and he surely remembered today. And then Bobby quipped back, yeah, but it helps to have Shakespeare write about you.
By the way, we have an anonymous texter who says, I am in tears listening to Doris Kearns Goodwin. How do we get back to this level of integrity and honor? Glorious segment. I'm going to buy the book now. We're going to talk about how we get back to that in a couple of minutes. But staying with the book for a second, before Dick had this moment where he said, whatever he said, I love that bastard, or whatever he said to you that night.
See how he says it.
Whatever he said.
Probably more like you than me.
What was it like for the two of you when you were on different sides of the LBJ story? I said before you worked for him, but not at the same time that Dick did. And obviously he was totally disenchanted, which I think is an understatement, because of the war. What was it like for the two of you?
It was hard. It was hard because I felt so loyal to LBJ. I mean, without LBJ, my presidential historian career would not have happened. I mean, I got a White House fellowship. Mm-hmm. You know, as you know, I think we've talked about this. I danced at the White House in the celebration. And then 2 days later or so, an article I'd written prior to being made a White House fellow about LBJ and the war came out in the New Republic with the title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And instead of kicking me out of the program, he just said, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. And I got to know him very well. I helped him on his memoirs. I got to know Lady Bird very well. I was loyal to them. And when Dick would just continually talk about the war, I wanted to talk about the Great Society. And I kept saying, but he passed all the bills that your guy, JFK, then my guy inspired your guy, he would say. It wasn't funny. It was a sad kind of argument because the loyalties were in different directions. And then through the book itself and the working on the projects and the boxes, I began to see what JFK was like as a young man and how extraordinary he was in learning. He could learn from his mistakes. He became a much better speaker. At the beginning, he spoke so fast. I think about this because I speak so fast. He spoke so fast that people said that he looked like a student. He couldn't wait to get back to his place. But then he would ask the reporters, how did I do? Where did I lose them? And I really began to respect even more. And you saw from the Bay of Pigs, he made a mistake. He acknowledged it right away, which is not happening many times today. And then he learned for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I began to develop more feeling for him and he for LBJ. So we came together in the end, realizing that the two of them, they all sort of make one. If they'd been one president, they would have been the best there possibly could have been.
Well, you painted a very homey, inviting picture of the LBJ Ranch down in Texas, which you visited many times.
Yeah, it was. The first time I went was Memorial Day weekend in 1968. And what a time it was. We got there, and it was late, but he wanted to go swimming in the pool immediately at midnight. And then at 7 in the morning, I'm called to go back in the pool. I don't know how I did I would have been worried about my hair all the time. And I don't like to swim necessarily, but he liked to talk in the pool. So you talked, and meanwhile, there were rafts on which there were floating phones and floating memo pads in case you wanted to say something. And then we had Gregory Peck was there that weekend. Henry Ford was there. I mean, for me as a young graduate student, it was an experience never to be forgotten. And he was just, he was a formidable guy. He would drive you around the ranch, show you where he was born, and then he talked. And then in the last years of his life, when he really talked to me about hoping that he would be remembered for other things than Vietnam, he wanted to talk to me about Congress and about civil rights. Those were my 2 chapters in the memoir, so it made him happy. So I just listened to him, and he could never stop talking, and I loved listening.
He also had a lot of ailments, depression and anxiety you talk about as well. Heart disease, we knew about that, but he was not a well man for quite some time.
And especially what would happen is before every election, some physical ailment would come, appendicitis or kidney stones. I mean, real physical ailments, but somehow stress had brought these things on. And so he one time wrote a letter to a friend saying, just remember that politicians are strange ducks. Anyone that has to go down begging on their knees for people to vote for them, it's going to be really hard when an election comes. So know that when the election's over, I'll be okay again.
Before we take a break, we've discussed Bobby Kennedy a lot here. Your husband wrote the Day of Affirmation speech, did he not? Let's just listen to a little piece of what Bobby Kennedy had to say. This is 1966, and he's speaking at the University of Cape Town.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
Can it get any more beautiful and powerful in one sentence? It is just incredible.
And that's on his grave, actually. It's on Robert Kennedy's grave.
Yeah.
And Dick Goodwin was with him in Los Angeles.
He was with him when he died, yes. But if we could just go back to that speech, because I think what's so important about it is that the kids who were there at Cape Town were fighting apartheid, and they were under enormous pressure from the government. In fact, the person who'd invited him to the speech was banned for 5 years, which meant that he couldn't leave his room. The next person who was the vice president was Margie Marshall, who becomes Margie Marshall, our Margie Marshall in Boston, Chief Justice, who makes gay marriage possible. She was with him that whole time. And I had never known that. We had known her and her husband, Tony Lewis, and for some reason we'd never spoken about the fact that this part of that speech was at her wedding ceremony with Tony. It was on Tony's memorial. And now I've connected to Margie, and we've talked about this whole thing. It's wonderful. It's just been a great part of this whole process.
You know, I don't know how to put this because Margie's going to mock me when I ask this question before we take a break. When you are able, out of your head, Dick, to come out with not only the most beautiful language that one can possibly imagine, but the most impactful, beautiful language, I didn't know when I heard that speech. I didn't know when I heard We Shall Overcome. I didn't know when I heard the Great Society speech that this guy, Dick Goodwin, was responsible for those words. Was that hard? I know. Stop it, Margie. I know you're going to say,
he would have wanted
because Jim
a
wants
byline.
credit for everything, right? That is exactly what. Was it hard for him? I mean, he had a pretty big ego too, by the way. Was it hard for him?
I think what he would be, this is one of the few times when he would be humble and aware of realities. None of it would have mattered if the people themselves didn't have the convictions. So if he had written that speech for himself to give in Brookline, it might have been exciting. Or as he said, if Patrick Henry had said, give me liberty or give me death at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, it would have meant nothing, right? But so he knew that he needed the convictions, and he knew Lyndon Johnson well, so he knew what he believed. He'd talked to him many times about civil rights. He knew Bobby well. He knew what Bobby cared about. And similarly, you know, when you work in JFK, you know that. You have to learn their cadences. You can't speak the same way for any of them. So that was a talent, but mostly it depended upon the person in power having the courage and the willingness to say the things that you want him to say.
Before we take a break, can we end the discussion about the book before we talk about current events at the beginning? Just spend a minute and describe that first encounter with Dick Goodwin when you're sitting in your second floor office at Harvard and this guy happens in.
Yeah, it was 1972, so it was after both of us had not ever met during Lyndon Johnson's time. And we heard that we were all nerds there, of course. We're history and government people. We'd heard that Richard Goodwin was coming to take a room there to finish a book, and we knew he'd worked for Kennedy and Johnson and Bobby. So we were excited. But I was up in my office on the second floor, and all of a sudden he just plops in with his wild eyebrows, his wild hair, and he sits on the chair where my two T's were supposed to sit. And he just starts off, so you're a graduate student, are you? And I said, no, I'm an assistant professor. And I told him all the things that I was teaching. And we started talking, and we talked all that afternoon. We talked about JFK and LBJ, but we talked about the beleaguered Red Sox, of which we were both enormous fans. We talked about music and astronomy, and he was philosophy. He was so interested in so many things. Then we continued talking in Boston that night. We went to a restaurant in Back Bay, and then we talked for 42 more years.
It's beautiful.
We are talking with Doris Kearns Goodwin. The book is an unfinished love story, a personal history of the 1960s. We're going to keep talking with Doris Kearns Goodwin after a quick break. You're listening to Boston Public Radio, 89.7 GBH. We are broadcasting live from the Boston Public Library and streaming at youtube.com/GBH News.
I'm Jared Bowen. Coming up on The Culture Show, our Arts and Culture Week in Review live at our Boston Public Library studio. Eurovision, the Olympics of pop music featuring acts from ABBA to Zora, is having its most politically charged competition in its history. We also remember artist Frank Stella, who was born in Malden and made a seismic splash in New York in the 1960s before becoming one of our most revered and relevant artists. That and more on The Culture Show today at 2 on 89.7 GBH.
Funding for our programs comes from you. And We Clean Heat Pumps, providing cleaning and maintenance of ductless mini-split heat pumps for the protection of air quality in homes and businesses as AC season is here. More at WeCleanHeatPumps.com. And Eversource, committed to helping businesses reach sustainability goals and lower their energy use through energy assessments and custom recommendations. Learn more at Eversource.com.
Trusted, local, news. You're listening to 89.7 WGBH, HD1 Boston, online at gbhnews.org. GBH News with NPR. What matters to you?
Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. Marge Regan and Jim Browdy. We're live at the Boston Public Library, streaming at youtube.com/GBH News. I think it's fair to say the only thing better than reading an unfinished love story, a personal history of the 1960s, is listening to Doris Kearns Goodwin talk about an unfinished love story, a personal history of the 60s. We're graced by her presence. She'll be at the First Parish Church tonight in Cambridge for a Harvard bookstore event in conversation with Beth Lasky, who's right over there. For more information, go to harvard.com/events.
That's right. You can also listen to it in Audible Books because you did the narration on Audible Books.
did.
Yeah, usually the authors don't get the cut, Doris Kearns Goodwin. You did. Yeah, that was great. So I mentioned during the break that there's a section in the book toward the end when you're talking about the 1968 convention, and of course that became a very violent scene out there in Chicago, and Eugene McCarthy, your husband, was involved with him. So tell us about that whole scene. And the reason I bring it up now is we're having campus demonstrations right now about a different subject.
Now, of course, this is what I've been thinking about a lot. I've been transported back in time to what was going on in the campuses in the 1960s. And there's two different models for what happened in the 1960s with campus desire to end the war in Vietnam. The first was that in 1968, Eugene McCarthy agreed to run for the presidency against Lyndon Johnson. And all over the country, kids came from every state of the country, and they planted themselves in New Hampshire, the first primary. The boys cut their hair and their beards so that they could be able to persuade people. The girls wore long dresses. They went in every Democratic house in New Hampshire, and they simply talked to the people. And this was a time when old and young were split apart, and the people loved to hear them believe in something, and they voted for McCarthy as a result of that. So those kids were incredibly successful. And what happened was after he won that primary almost, then Lyndon Johnson decided 2 weeks later to give a speech where he said he was going to stop the bombing, which was part of what the critics wanted. He was going to negotiate with the North Vietnamese, and he was going to withdraw from the race. And here's where fate intervenes. He was so well received for that. People said he was sacrificing himself for the good of the country. All of a sudden, signs were, "Thank you, Mr. Johnson." And then on April 3rd, North Vietnam agreed to come to the bargaining table. He said it was the happiest day of his presidency. On April 4th, the whole White House plane is loaded with people to go to Hawaii. Lyndon Johnson was supposed to join them later that night to start the talks, and he gets a message that Martin Luther King had been shot. And then riots take place, everything gets derailed, and the peace talks take a while to happen. And then the frustration is still there when then Bobby Kennedy dies, and then the same kids come to the Democratic National Convention, but there are also lots of other groups that are there with other agendas. Some of them want to just mayhem, some of them just disturbing, and Mayor Daley has thousands of police ready, and confrontations happen, and the Democrats lose the election that night.
I'm betting you read the Nick Kristof piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago where he talked about the parallels 1968 in Chicago and the riots, 2024 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Bernie Sanders said the other day Gaza could be Joe Biden's Vietnam. Could it be?
Well, I think it so much depends on what's going to happen now. I mean, what the story of 1968 tells us, nobody would have guessed in March that Lyndon Johnson would not be in the race, that Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King would die. It's hard to know what the state of the war will be by the time we're in October or November. Maybe with some luck there's a ceasefire that takes hold. Maybe there's beginning talks about what might happen for the future of those two beleaguered lands. And then it might be less of an importance. But right now it's obviously got the same message. So once you get violence, once buildings are taken over or traffic is disrupted, then it's much harder to allow you to create public sentiment, which is what you're hoping to do in the long run. And that's what happened in 1968 at the Democratic Convention.
Although here, we've talked a lot about whether colleges have handled this the right way. We had MIT last night at 4 o'clock in the morning bringing in, early in the morning, I should say, 4 o'clock in the morning, bringing in state troopers to get the students out of there. I mean, there's a lot of upset about these campus situations. On the other hand, they're bringing a lot of attention to what is going on in Gaza. So how do you handle this?
I mean, I think what you know is that for young people to be deeply involved in caring about an issue, this one is so complicated, though, obviously much more so in many ways than anti-war was in the 1960s. And then you have to be so careful of the messages you're leaving, and some of it has dealt into anti-Semitism, and then you're going to lose the very battle if you have hatred on that side when there's so much that needs to be fought on the side of humanitarian aid and what needs to go on in Gaza. So that it requires a really complicated, sensitive way. And the thing different, I think, you need leaders that can keep you disciplined and keep you on the subject of what you care about deeply.
So Doris Kearns Goodwin, if we were talking to you, let's say in 2015 or 2014, and we said in not too many years, there's going to be a guy leading for the presidency who is found in a civil proceeding to have raped a woman, a guy who in another proceeding is found to have committed $500 million of business fraud, and a guy who is credibly accused of attempting to overthrow the government of the United States. And if the election were today, John King said to us last week, he'd likely be the next president of the United States. How do you explain that? I
think the hardest thing for me to have imagined in 2014 was that there would be a loser in a presidential race who was unwilling to accept the loss. Every other time in our history, it's very hard for a person who's lost a race to go and give that concession speech.
Didn't Dick write the Gore thing?
Dick worked with Al Gore on that concession speech, too. I mean, here, Al Gore felt that the Supreme Court had made the wrong decision, but he gets right up there and says the Supreme Court has spoken, it's the law of the land, and I now wish a great stewardship on the president-elect. Hillary Clinton said it's how hard this was, but on the other hand, we don't only respect the tradition of the peaceful transition of power, we cherish it. The only other time this happened, except for 2020, was in 1860. And what Lincoln said 1860 was about was the Democratic South had lost the election to the Republicans, and they were unwilling to accept that loss. So what did they do? They seceded from the Union. And he said if a democracy can allow that to happen, then democracy is an absurdity. And I would never have imagined that for the first time since then, we would have a president who didn't say, okay, I'm sorry, I feel bad, I lost, it hurts, but I accept this tradition.
Okay, so why do 70-plus million people not only accept that, but are enamored of the man who did what you just described?
Well, in part because the same thing is happening now that was happening in the 1850s. In the 1850s, you had a media that was not a generalized media. If you came from a Whig party or the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, that was the only way you got your news. So, for example, suppose Lincoln is at a debate with Stephen Douglas, and Douglas, the paper, the Democratic paper, said he was so great, he was carried out on, no, the Republican paper would say that Lincoln was so great, carried out on the arms of his supporters. Democratic paper would say he was so terrible, he fell on the floor and he had to be dragged out. So truth was at issue then, and that was part of the problem. Truth is at issue now. People don't believe that that election was lost. They think somehow that Mr. Trump is standing on their side. There's a sense of grievance about America, and he's allowing himself to be the person who talks about that. And we have to understand that somehow in order to heal. Eventually, it's going to take a long time to heal from this. We have to figure out how to knit the country back together again.
Do you think we will heal from this?
We have before. I mean, this is what, as a historian, the great thing that history provides is perspective and solace and knowing that we're in tough times now. We've been in really, really, really tough times before. It was much worse in the Civil War. It was worse in the early Depression. It was worse in the early days of World War II when they thought that Hitler would conquer all of Western Europe. And the thing is, the people living then, they didn't know how it was going to end. We know now that the Civil War ends with the Union restored. We know that the Depression came to an end with the mobilization for the war. We know the Allies won world. They didn't know that. We don't know how this is going to end. But somehow, the combination of we've got to get people back into public life. Public life was an honorable thing to do in the 1960s. We need to have more people of character entering public life. Nothing is more important than character. You have to have a person with humility, with empathy, with resilience, with accountability, with responsibility, with ambition for something larger than themselves. And we need those kind of people to be entering. And that's why we have to hope that young people will believe in the system enough. They don't trust the system anymore, enough to enter it, because that's us. We are the government. Unless we're in it, then who else is in it?
How do you restore that trust with young people? We're talking to Doris Kearns Goodwin, obviously, by the way. How do you reestablish that bond of trust with young voters, with young people?
I think the only way you do it is get young people to start working in their local areas, as journalists or as people that are working on projects in the state areas. Maybe it's not going to happen at the national level. Sometimes I think I'd love to see a national service program if I had one thing to do.
Too.
If you bring kids from high school and they have a year and they go from the west to the east or the north to the south or, a farm country to a city, and then they have a common mission to accomplish. I mean, this is what the military does so well. My son will say, having been in Iraq and Afghanistan because of joining after 9/11, that nothing will make him prouder than having had a platoon of people from different classes, religions, parties, and pulling them together for a common enemy, for a common cause, not just against a common enemy.
I don't mean to be Debbie Downer, but I've said so many times on the radio that until maybe, I don't know, a few years back, I used to think we make a lot of mistakes in the United States. We do things wrong. There's corruption. There's, all these errors. But eventually we'll do the right thing. And I've stopped feeling that in the last few years. And when I was reading your book, I think of these giants of the Senate, the Mike Mansfields and the Everett Dirksen, and how people, not that there weren't scoundrels, but there seemed to be just more integrity, a sense of shame, a sense that you just can't go out. I know you talked about people lying and the truth being at odds, but people just getting on television over and lying, and that they know that they're lying. Something's happened.
Well, you wonder whether or not it takes so much now to run for office. You know that you're going to have to raise a lot of money. You know your private life is going to be exposed. You know that you're going to be under attack, terrible attack, untruthful attack. And it may be that lots of people don't want to do it. And then they look at Washington, well, what fun is that to be down there when they can't accomplish anything? So somehow there are generations, I think, that go into public life. And that's what you need. We had rendezvous with destiny in World War II. We had it at the turn of the 20th century. Lincoln was told he was a liberator. He said, don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement that did it all, and the Union soldiers. So we've just got to hope that somehow there'll be a wave of people that think, and maybe not at the national level first, maybe it'll be local, maybe it'll be school boards, maybe it'll be cities, but then they get that sense of what it feels like to make something happen, even if it's something small in your own city, or if this national service program could work. David McCullough, the historian's grandson, is working on the American Exchange, a miniature version of that, just taking kids from high school for a week from one place to another, and then they go back to that other person's place, and then they communicate with each other after they learn to feel what the other people are feeling. Teddy Roosevelt said the greatest danger to democracy would be if people in different sections, regions, and parties begin to view each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. And that's where we're at today, so we've got to break that somehow.
One last thing from me, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and actually we wish you would stay for the next couple of weeks.
Oh, I'm here. Is there a pillow back here?
We'll get you one, trust me. I don't know if you saw the interview that Ben Smith, who was the former media columnist for the New York Times, did with Joey Kahn running the Times. And one of the questions he asked him, Ben Smith asked him recently, why don't you see your job as we've got to stop Donald Trump? And Kahn said what one would expect, which was we have to discuss the policy issues, the differences. It's not our job. What is the media's job when, again, a candidate is running who I think you can credibly say, even if you're the New York Times, attempted to overthrow the government of the United States? What balance should the media find in covering this campaign and covering Donald Trump?
I think the most important thing is the last thing you said, somebody who attempted to overthrow the United States government that way. I think that's much more important than any of these other trials that are going on right now. I mean, that's a centerpiece, what happened there. And I thought wrongly after January 6th that the country would change its mind and that they would understand, but then it was made to seem as if it was something other than what it really was. I thought when the hearings took place that was going to be it. Maybe the election campaign will be a time. I think that's what should be focused on. It's the most important thing, that's outside the realm of normal discourse in our country. And the rest of the stuff in terms of the sex, and I much more care about that than anything else.
So,
I don't mean in general.
No, I understand.
okay.
I just went around all day just thinking about January 6th.
So one last thing for me. We've got Trump and Biden and RFK Jr. with the dead worm in his head running for president.
Feel free to comment on that, Doris. Go ahead.
And a lot of the polls, Trump and Biden are neck and neck, and most all the polls they're neck and neck. One's a little ahead there, one's a little not ahead there. So a lot of us, and I'm one of them, are really concerned that if Trump does win, this is could be the end of the American experiment here, given what he could do unleashed in a second term. Am I wrong?
Well, first of all, I think the worrisome thing is what he's already said he would do in the second term. We know he'll go after his enemies, he'll be dictator for a day, etc. But there's still checks and balances in the system. The citizenry, I still think, let's just wait and see what happens during the election when we really, really focus. And people go into that voting booth and they decide who they want to be president. I'm not sure that these polls mean what they say. I still have a feeling that when you look at the independents, when you look at the people who really voted for Nikki Haley after she was no longer on there, that it's not maybe as close as it seems to be. I don't think it would be at all close if we didn't have the Electoral College and things like that, because the overwhelming majority of the people, when you look at them, what do they care about? They care about climate change. They care about gun safety. They care about a woman's right to choose. And those are the major issues that are on one side, and the other side is different from that, but different in an even deeper way, as you say. And so just let's see if we can trust the American people when it comes down to it.
We're going to play that clip nonstop. So before you go, actually, we now know what Dick Goodwin did for you. What do the Red Sox do for you?
Oh, my God.
Oh, the Red Sox.
What do they do? The exultation. When was it the Ken Burns? Where were you
Yeah,
the
Ken Burns
thing? What's with you?
What
is it?
Well, now wait. First, I started as a Brooklyn Dodger fan, right?
I know that.
I love them, and then they abandoned me, and then I come up here and I fall in love with the Red Sox, and year after year after year, they almost always win, and then year after year they lose. And then finally they win. And now at my age, even though people get mad at them if they're not doing well on a particular summer, I still just dream about 2004 or 2013. It was the best thing in the world to finally win. I don't think it would have been as much fun if we hadn't lost for such a period of time. It was a great, great day. Nothing to be compared. I used to think maybe it's not as much fun to be a Yankee fan. You win every year. You don't cherish it as much. I don't know. Now it might be nice to have it every year, but I think nothing will beat that. We
Look
were
at the
all
smile
together.
on her face.
Oh,
That's
it was the
pretty
best.
great.
David Ortiz for president.
It's our effing city. It absolutely is. Doris Kearns Goodwin, this was a total joy, and the book is spectacular.
Oh, I thank you so much.
It's
the best to be with you. You guys are the best.
We love you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.